And like I said, I had seen this movie before, and despite it being like 20 or so years ago, I still remembered vividly the scene when she rams into the car of the rude girls. And then also, of course, I remember the aspect, because how could you forget that shocking ending? Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fannie Flagg, published in 1987, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by John Avnet, which was released in 1991. And this has been requested by Lilial Croc, Angela Holmes, and Alex King, so I hope you all enjoy this video, and be sure and share your thoughts down below in the comments. And this book and movie is about Evelyn, an ordinary housewife in 1980s Alabama who befriends a woman temporarily living in a nursing home named Ninny. The woman is named Ninny, not the nursing home. But the two bond as Ninny tells Evelyn stories from her past that center around two women, one named Idgie and one named Ruth, who own a cafe starting from 1930 into the 1950s in a town called Whistle Stop, Alabama. And this movie is very memorable and has an incredible cast, and it jumps back and forth in time from present day to the past with Idgie and Ruth. And the past is told chronologically. Whereas in the book, the past jumps all over the place. Like, we'll start out in like, oh, a story from 1941. And then the next minute we're in 1929, and then 1932, and just it jumps all over the place in the past. And I personally did not love this. Like, it makes sense because the stories are told based on how Ninny remembers them, so it makes sense that she would not remember things chronologically. And yet, I just felt like the book would have been better organized had it just been told linearly as far as the past goes. And then we also get these weekly bulletins from a woman who lived at Whistle Stop through the decades. These sections are also great because it informs us on different details about these characters and the town itself, but does so in such a concise way. And it's also just really cute and funny, and it's from the perspective of someone there in the moment at that time and place. I'll admit there were times when I felt like they were a bit unnecessary, and yet at the end of the day, they were cute and fun, and again, it gave us a better picture of the whole town, and the book does do a better job at focusing on so many of the citizens of Whistle Stop, and so I did like that. And for the most part, yeah, I did really enjoy this book, and I liked the characters, and it's funny, if funny is the right word, because so much heavy stuff happens, and yet it's not written in a heavy way. And I sometimes have mixed feelings about this, because I feel like when a book is writing about domestic abuse, rape, violent racism, poverty, death, like all of these things are so serious, and I feel like a book that is talking about these things shouldn't be the kind of book you look forward to picking up. It should be one where you're like, man, like this is a lot, but it's so good that I'm going to read it even though it's so heavy. And so sometimes I feel like that's how those topics should be handled. And yet at the same time, I do think there's something to stories that talk about heavy topics in a lighter way, because it can kind of show. And Idgie is a great example of this, of how bad things can happen in your life, but you can't let it keep you down. And in fact, having a sense of humor about it can, not everything has to be so serious. Even when it is serious, like it can help to just take a more lighthearted approach in life. And maybe, again, maybe even these heavy topics don't always have to be written in such a heavy way, I guess. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it, as you can tell. I feel like books like this have their merits, and it doesn't glamorize it the way some books do. But yeah, it's so many heavy topics, and yet it's such a lighthearted book for the most part. And I did think that, again, specific to the book, I thought that Fannie Flagg, who is a white woman, I thought she did a good job at developing the Black characters as well, and she kept them from just being like these stereotypes. And so I did appreciate that too. And same goes for Smokey Lonesome, who is this tramp who is, like hopping trains throughout America and has no home. And that too, he could have been written in a very stereotypical way, not showing the reality of it. But she does a great job at developing him and telling us about his life and not romanticizing it and making him a full-fleshed character, not just a stereotype. And something that I had heard about this book and movie before reading or watching it, although I have seen this movie before. I watched it like 20 years ago. But leading up to this time, something I had heard about this book was that the book is very straightforward and that Idgie and Ruth are a gay couple, and yet the movie dances around this and doesn't face it head on. And I honestly, though, like, I felt like the book at times felt like it was dancing around it. And so that surprised me, especially because Fanny Flagg herself was gay. And so I was expecting this to be a much more straightforward approach and just very explicit that they are in a romantic relationship. And I don't mean explicit as in like I want explicit sex scenes. I just wanted it like no doubt whatsoever in your mind, right, that they are in love. And I mean, maybe that's not fair to say about the book because they do say I love you. And it talks about how Idgie, when she is young, she has a crush on Ruth, which obviously is romantic. And so the way the book is written, clearly they have a deep love for each other, a deep romantic love for each other. And they raise a child together, and the town refers to the child as Idgie and Ruth's son. But I guess what really surprised me, and maybe this is what threw me off, is the fact that the town has no issue with the fact that they're a gay couple. And this is a religious town in the South in the 1920s into the 50s. And so it's awesome that they didn't experience any prejudice. And yet part of me was like, I don't feel like this is an accurate portrayal, though, if they were a true lesbian couple right at this time. But then also labels maybe were not as common at all. And so maybe because they didn't have these specific labels like, oh, we're a gay couple, maybe people in town really did just think they were business partners and best friends. And so maybe that's why they didn't experience any prejudice. And I do want to read a section from this book, and this is from, as you will see, when Ruth realizes she loves Idgie, and we read. It's funny, most people can be around someone and then gradually begin to love them and never know exactly when it happened. But Ruth knew the very second it happened to her. When Idgie had grinned at her and tried to hand her that jar of honey, all these feelings that she had been trying to hold back came flooding through her, and it was at that second in time that she knew she loved Idgie with all her heart. And now, a month later, it was because she loved her so much that she had to leave. Idgie was a 16-year-old kid with a crush and couldn't possibly understand what she was saying. She had no idea when she was begging Ruth to stay and live with them what she was asking. But Ruth knew, and she realized she had to get away. She had no idea why she wanted to be with Idgie more than anybody else on this earth, but she did. She had prayed about it, had cried about it, but there was no answer except to go back home and marry Frank Bennett, the young man she was engaged to marry, and try to be a good wife and mother. Ruth was sure that no matter what Idgie said, she would get over her crush and get on with her life. Ruth was doing the only thing she could do. And so again, in that section, it's pretty explicit that they have a romantic love for each other. But when I read this, I interpreted this also to Ruth realizing the discrimination they would face. And so that's when she's like, Idgie doesn't know the full breadth of what she is asking when she wants to be with me because she's a 16-year-old kid and she doesn't realize. And yet they didn't face any discrimination. And so, yeah, Again, it's good. There's no hate crimes against gay people in this book. And yet it threw me. And I was like, do the townspeople not realize? Or like, are they in denial about it? Like, and maybe I was misinterpreting those sections of the book. Maybe that's not what she meant when she was having those thoughts. But another thing I found weird again is that in the book, there's a part when Idgie is talking to their son when he is a teenager. And she's asking him like, why don't you date? Like, don't you like girls? Why are you never going out with girls? And he tells her like, oh, don't worry. Like, I like girls. I'm not weird, meaning he's not gay. And so that too seemed like an odd scene in the book because it's like, why, like he's talking to one of his lesbian moms right now. And it was just another one of those things where I was like, she and Ruth had been in a romantic relationship, right? Like, am I missing something here? Like, why is he feeling the need to be like, oh, don't worry, I'm not weird. Like your mom is quote unquote weird. So yeah, I was just kind of thrown by how at times this wasn't as direct as I wanted it to be. And also, by the way, this was written in the 80s, but The Color Purple was also written in the 80s. And that is very direct in the lesbian romance that is going on there. And so it was being done in the 80s. And so I guess that's what I was wanting from this book. And also for it to be a bigger focus of the book, I guess, kind of like in The Color Purple, where people are kind of thrown by this being like, wait, what? Like you don't like men? And maybe exploring that theme more. But it doesn't really explore the theme of being gay. It's just showing a gay relationship and yet not as in depth as I would have liked. But then the movie, this definitely dances around the topic so much more than the book does, of course. And by the way, so I did watch this before back in, the mid 2000s, and I grew up in a somewhat conservative home. And as I watched this, I had no idea that they were romantically involved. And so it's funny because watching it now, it seems so clear that that is the subtext. And there are so many scenes that are on the brink of, it's like right there. They just need to push it just slightly to make it clear that they're in love, and yet the movie is choosing to hold back. So it's like they're trying to play both sides because it's like, well, we'll have some scenes so that people in the know can realize they're in love, and yet we won't go for it too much. That way we also won't like offend anybody by portraying a real lesbian romance on screen. And so again, even though watching it now, I'm like, man, like they're clearly, like the actors have such great chemistry and you can tell they have a romance between them. And yet again, I watched this when I was a teenager and I did not realize this about them. So I'm sure plenty of people have seen this movie and they really do just think it's a story about friendship. So yeah, at the end of the day, both book and movie are very clearly gay in my mind. And yet both of them, I wanted to be even gayer. So let me know your thoughts on that down below in the comments. And from here on out, I will be getting into the details of the plot, which means we will have spoilers going forward. So from book to movie, the story of Idgie and Ruth is a bit different. So in the movie, Idgie's brother and best friend Buddy was courting Ruth. So I guess Buddy and Ruth were like in their teens, but Idgie at this point seems to be like 10, I guess. And when she and Ruth are with Buddy, he gets hit by a train right in front of the two of them. And so the both of them are scarred by this, and Idgie shuts people out and Ruth moves away, I guess. And then years later, Idgie's parents ask Ruth to come stay with them because the mother is hoping it will get Idgie to open up and spend more time with her family who miss her and love her. And Idgie is reluctant at first to spend time with Ruth, but Ruth proves she is up to Idgie's rebellious tomboy ways. But by the end of summer, Idgie and Ruth, they both have feelings for each other, clearly, but Ruth is engaged to be married, and so she still has to leave. Whereas in the books, Buddy is hit by a train, and this deeply impacts Idgie because they were so close. By the way, in the book, Buddy was not courting Ruth. In fact, Buddy was in love with Eva. And Eva, we see her briefly in the movie, but she was a bigger character in the book. So she is the town lady that people go to for a good time. But Buddy was in love with her, and he was going to marry her, we can assume. However, he ended up dying. But yeah, and so Idgie is heartbroken by this loss. And then after a number of years, Ruth, a stranger, has come into town for the summer to help out with, I think it's like a church thing. And Idgie has an intense crush on Ruth. She falls head over heels for her. However, like we saw in the movie, Ruth is engaged to be married to a man back home. And so despite the fact that she loves Idgie as well, again, Idgie is only 16 at this point. Ruth is like 21. And so she is looking at things more rationally, and she has a sick mom back home. And so marrying Frank will also help her mother. And so, yeah, she has these responsibilities back home she feels committed to. And so despite her feelings for Idgie, she has to leave. As well as the fact that she realizes Idgie is just a kid too. So I do like that she leaves, and the book gives Idgie time to mature and grow before they actually get together. And in both, after a year or two pass, Idgie finds out that Ruth's husband, Frank, is abusive and he hits Ruth. And so she threatens to kill him. Idgie threatens to kill Frank. However, Ruth still feels stuck with this guy, and it isn't until some more time passes that she sends Idgie a letter. And in the letter, it's just a clip of a Bible quote. And Idgie interprets this and realizes that this is Ruth saying she wants Idgie to come get her. And in the movie, Ruth already knew that she was pregnant, whereas in the book, she doesn't realize this until already being with Idgie after a little bit. But yeah, so after they come and get Ruth, she and Idgie make a life together. And after she gives birth, Idgie is given some money to open up a cafe now that she has, a wife basically and a child to provide for. And so they open the Whistle Stop Cafe and raise their son, Buddy. But Buddy, the son, later gets the nickname Stump when his arm is run over by the train and he loses it. And Idgie is the one that starts calling him Stump right away because she figures he won't be insecure about it if they just bring awareness to it in this light and funny way, just right off the bat. So again, kind of like what I was saying earlier about how even something serious, you can have a light approach to it in life, and sometimes you'll be better off for it. But yeah, Idgie and Ruth stay together until Ruth is in her late 30s, which means they were together for like over 15 years. But Ruth in both ends up getting cancer and dying. And in the movie, Idgie is right there with Ruth as she dies. However, in the book, Anzel, a woman that worked for them at the Whistle Stop Cafe, she loved Ruth. I mean, the whole town loved Ruth. But she sends Idgie away, and while Idgie is gone, Anzel gives Ruth morphine because Ruth is in so much pain, and Anzel just wants to put Ruth out of her suffering. So that is how she officially dies in the book. And in the end of the book and movie, Idgie is still alive in the 80s when we are with Evelyn and Ninny. And in the movie, it's kind of mysterious and we don't actually see Idgie. And this is something I'll be getting into later. But we see that she still is alive because she leaves a jar of honey on Ruth's grave. Whereas in the book, we see Idgie. We go to a town in Florida and we see her as an old woman selling honey off of a highway. And she is still telling her tall tales and being generous and kind. But there is a murder that takes place, which is a pretty big part of the story. This is a bigger thing in the movie, I would say, but it is definitely a focal point of the book as well. But Frank, he shows up and he threatens Ruth. And then he returns another night and he disappears. And the cops come to question them at Whistle Stop, but no one knows anything. And we are led to believe, especially in the movie, that Idgie killed him, or maybe perhaps the homeless guy, Smokey Lonesome. But we basically find out that the petite black woman named Sipsy, who cooks for them at the cafe, was looking over baby Buddy while Ruth and Idgie were out. When Frank, this is when he came over, and after attacking Sipsy, she then gets back up and hits him in the head with a pan, which kills him. And Big George, Sipsy's adopted son, he then drives the truck into a lake, and then they bury his clothes, and then they chop up his body, and they serve him as barbecue the next day at the cafe. And in the movie, Idgie is part of this plan because after Frank is killed, they call and bring her over to the cafe. So she is the mastermind behind serving him in the barbecue. Whereas in the book, so that night, Idgie knew nothing. No one told her anything. Over time, maybe they told her, like by the time the trial happens, maybe Idgie knows the truth, but we don't know for sure. So she wasn't directly part of it the way we saw in the film. But yeah, so we get a court scene when the truck is found and Idgie and Big George, they are accused of murdering Frank. And Idgie takes the stand and, it's this big moment. However, they are both found innocent, or also like the case is just dismissed, basically, I think is actually what it is. Because the preacher comes up and he provides a fake alibi for Idgie and Big George, which clears them. And in the book, it's funny because the detective who had come to investigate Frank's disappearance, he admits to Idgie, like he wants to do his job. And yet at the same time, Frank, who was a horrible person just all the way around, he had impregnated this guy's daughter and caused her to like live as an outcast in the outskirts of town. And so he doesn't really care that much about Frank because he hates the guy. And this detective ends up being the judge by the time the trial happens, because in the book, the trial happens in 1955. So it's been like 25 years since Frank died. So now this guy is a judge and he knows that the preacher is lying. He knows the whole thing is a sham. But he doesn't care because he's like, screw Frank. I don't care about the fact that they killed him. And he lets them go. Whereas in the movie, we don't get this backstory on the judge. And it seems like he just truly believed what the preacher had said. But yeah, in the movie, the trial happens very soon after Frank's death, unlike the book. And so in the movie, Ruth is still alive when the trial happens and she takes the stand. And we get an emotional moment where they're pestering her, being like, oh, what did Idgie do to tempt you to leave your husband? And did she tempt you with alcohol and whatever? And Ruth is like, I went with her because I love her and she's the best friend I've ever had. Again, one of those moments, teetering on the brink, like she's telling the court how much she loves Idgie, but they're quick to add, like, she's the best friend I've ever had. And then we also have an added scene in the movie before the trial, but after Frank's disappearance, Ruth confronts Idgie and she's like, did you kill him? And Idgie says no. But it's hard to tell if she believes Idgie is telling the truth or not. But then it's a sweet moment because Ruth is like, maybe I should leave. I'm causing so much trouble for you guys. And Idgie is like, no, like, I want you here. I like my life with you. Like, don't leave. And so again, it's one of those moments that was so sweet and so emotional, and it's teetering on the brink of showing, like, it seems so obvious that it is a romantic moment, and yet they are also purposefully keeping themselves back from making it even more explicit. And so it was a sweet romantic moment, and yet it was also so frustrating that they didn't show more. By the way, I read that the actors involved, as well as Fanny Flagg, of course, they were all on board with them being more explicit about the romance. However, the director and the producers are the ones that were like, let's keep it more vague. So yeah, it's just unfortunate. But then to move on to Evelyn and Ninny, so the storyline happening in the 80s. So this too is a bit different, specifically with the ending. So in both, Evelyn is inspired by Ninny and her stories of Idgie and Ruth to change her own life and to stop being passive. And Ninny also encourages her to work for Mary Kay, which ends up being a big success for Evelyn. And she just makes Evelyn realize that she is capable of so much more. And she also improves her eating habits and exercising more. And in the book, she has been visiting Ninny for like over a year when she then goes to California for 2 months to stay at this health retreat. And while she is at this retreat, it's a super positive experience and she gets to learn more about herself and she grows in confidence. And she also is able to move further away from her angry phase and she's just at peace and so happy with how things are going. When she then gets a letter saying that Ninny has died. So she was at the nursing home just temporarily because she had a friend who was at the nursing home, so she was there keeping the friend company. However, she eventually went back to her own home, and so Ninny was living in her own home when she passed away. And so the neighbor wrote to Evelyn being like, oh, Ninny has died, but she left some things for you, so whenever you want to come by, I'll be happy to give them to you. And so when Evelyn goes to pick up these items, that is when she sees Whistle Stop for the first time and she mourns the death of her friend. Whereas in the movie, again, Evelyn has been giving her life an overhaul. And then one day near the end, she goes to visit Ninny and they are removing her stuff from her room. And she is told that the woman that had been in here died that morning. And Evelyn cries because she didn't get to say goodbye and didn't get to fully tell Ninny how much she meant to her. However, another nurse then comes in and she tells her like, oh, Ninny didn't die. She just went home. It's the other woman that had been in here that died. And so it was kind of funny because I was getting so emotional watching this scene. Kathy Bates, she's just so good. And then they pull like a bait and switch and suddenly it's like, oh, nope, she didn't actually die. She's still alive. So they definitely got me with that one. However, in the movie, Evelyn knows that Ninny's house has been torn down. And so she's like, she doesn't have a home to go home to. And so she hurries and leaves and drives to Whistle Stop where she sees Ninny. And the two talk more about Whistle Stop and they see the honey jar that was left by Idgie. And then in the end, Evelyn, she invites Ninny to live with her. And so in the end, they drive together back to Evelyn's house. And Evelyn had told her husband that she wanted Ninny to move in with them. And the husband was like, no, like I'm putting my foot down. This can't happen. But Evelyn, again, she's not having it. She's not being like the doting housewife who's so passive and does whatever her husband wants. She's like, no, I don't care what you say. This is what I want. And this is happening. And she also, expresses to Ed how much the relationship with Ninny has meant to her. But in the end of the movie, it's interesting though, because they see the honey jar from Idgie and Evelyn is like, whoa, Idgie is still alive. I thought she died. And and Ninny is like, oh no, she's still alive. We might see her. And Evelyn is like, yeah, we just might see her. And it's this moment that almost seems to imply that Ninny is Idgie. And on one hand, I kind of like this twist to the film. However, it doesn't really add up because she talks about being in love with Buddy, having a crush on him, which would be weird considering if this is Idgie, that would be her brother. And she also talks about having a special needs son, which is from the book, and we hear more about this. And so it's like, did she just make up that story of the son then? And so multiple things, it just doesn't add up that she is Idgie. And I think the filmmakers have even clarified, because a lot of people had this thought, but the filmmakers clarified like, no, that's not what we intended. But I think it's weird because in the book, when she tells flashback stories about Idgie and Ruth, Ninny is part of these stories, right? Like she is there being involved with things, on the outskirts of it, but she's still part of some of these flashbacks. Whereas in the movie, in the flashbacks, we don't have a young Ninny around. And so she knows these stories so well. And yet how was she not part of any of these events when she was younger? And so I think that was a huge oversight on the filmmaker's part, not to just have this character of Ninny be there in the scenes with Idgie and Ruth. And yeah, in the book, we learn a lot more about Ninny and her life, and I did enjoy that. And so yeah, the fact that the movie chose not to talk about Ninny's own life at all, yeah, it makes it seem like, oh, like, is she Idgie? I kind of like that thought, but anyway. But to talk about Evelyn a bit more. So in the book, Evelyn is definitely the character I was the most attached to. Like, we get things from her perspective, and so we are in her head so much more. And she also experiences the most change over the course of the story. And yeah, I just loved Evelyn and her transformation. And like I said, I had seen this movie before, and despite it being like 20 or so years ago, I still remembered vividly the scene when she rams into the car of the rude girls. And then also, of course, I remembered the cannibalism aspect, because how could you forget that shocking ending? And by the way, if I was one of the people who knew the truth about the barbecue, I would never be able to eat meat again in my life. But also in the movie, this is another thing where after Ninny tells Evelyn this story, Evelyn is like, what? Like, is that true? Because throughout this story, the character of Idgie tells so many ridiculous stories. And so Evelyn is like, is this just another tall tale? Whereas in the book, we get this in like a third person perspective section that shows that this really did happen in the world of the book. But anyway, so with Evelyn, I also like too how this book in particular talks about being in perimenopause and what that does to you emotionally, and how it gives you suicidal ideation, because Evelyn is having thoughts of ending her life. And then Ninny is the one who's like, oh, I think you're approaching menopause because this is what happens to you. And so I feel like this is something that does not have enough awareness, is these things to look out for as you approach menopause, including suicidal thoughts, right? So many women, I think, reach that age and start having these things happen and not realizing that that's what it's connected to. And in the book, when she starts to get angry for the first time in her life, she envisions an alter ego named Tawanda, and we hear about all of the things she fantasizes about doing as Tawanda. And in the book, this idea of Tawanda just came from Evelyn, whereas in the movie, we see that when Idgie does something rebellious, she calls herself Tawanda. And so in the book, when Evelyn, like before she rams into that car, we know that she is thinking about Idgie and like, oh, like what would Idgie do? And would Idgie put up with this? So we see how she's being influenced by these stories. But then in the movie, having Idgie call herself Tawanda is such a genius shorthand to let the audience know that Kathy Bates, Evelyn, is being inspired by Idgie, because then in the car, all she has to say is Tawanda. And that is how we know she's being inspired by Idgie. So yeah, this was just so genius. I just love the way they did this. But also, I just wanted to mention a funny scene in the movie is when she starts to make healthier food and her husband is like, are you trying to kill me with this? And she's like, oh no, if I was trying to kill you, I'd use my hands, which I just thought was so funny. And again, her transformation with her husband was so good because she was putting in a lot of work in the relationship and he just didn't care. And she was like just doing whatever he wanted. And so she finally is just like, what am I doing? Like, no, I'm going to do what I want. And I'm not going to be passive in this relationship anymore. But like I said, when she is at that health retreat, by the end of the book, Evelyn has let go of a lot of the anger she'd had during this phase when she is imagining Tawanda. And while I love her angry phase, I also love that she moves past it, because ideally, you shouldn't stay in the angry phase, right? Like, it's an important step, but eventually you get past that and you come to a place of peace and happiness, because once you start being true to yourself, kind of like there's no more reason to be angry and resentful, because now you are being yourself and living the life you want to. But also just learning acceptance too, about like, yeah, there's mean people in the world that are going to say mean things to you, but you don't need to let it get to you. And, if you have your own inner confidence, then people can say what they want and you can just not care. But I wanted to share a section, and it's kind of long, I apologize, but it's this long section in the book when Evelyn is feeling angry for the first time. And she has this revelation about herself and society and sexism. And we read, after the boy at the supermarket had called her those names, Evelyn Couch had felt violated, raped by words, stripped of everything. She had always tried to keep this from happening to her, always been terrified of displeasing men, terrified of the names she would be called if she did. She had spent her life tiptoeing around them like someone lifting her skirt stepping through a cow pasture. She had always suspected that if provoked, those names were always close to the surface, ready to lash out and destroy her. It had finally happened, but she was still alive. So she began to wonder, It was as if that boy's act of violence toward her had shocked her into finally looking at herself and asking the questions she had avoided for fear of the answers. What was this power, this insidious threat, this invisible gun to her head that controlled her life? This terror of being called names. She had stayed a virgin so she wouldn't be called a tramp or a slut. She had married so she wouldn't be called an old maid. Faked orgasms so she wouldn't be called frigid. Had children so she wouldn't be called barren. Had not been a feminist because she didn't want to be called queer or a man-hater. Never nagged or raised her voice so she wouldn't be called bitch. She had done all of this, and yet still, this stranger had dragged her into the gutter with the names that men call women when they are angry. Evelyn wondered, why always sexual names? And why, when men wanted to degrade other men, did they call them pussies? As if that was the worst thing in the world. What have we done to be thought of that way? People didn't call blacks names anymore, at least not to their faces. Italians weren't. And then she kind of just lists a lot of different slurs and how they're not used in polite conversation anymore. Everybody had a group to protest and stick up for them, but women were still being called names by men. Why? Where was our group? It's not fair. She was getting more upset by the minute. Evelyn thought, I wish Idgie had been with me. She would not have let that boy call her names. I'll bet she would have knocked him down. Then she made herself stop thinking because all of a sudden, she was experiencing a feeling that she had never felt before, and it scared her. And so, 20 years later than most women, Evelyn Couch was angry. She was angry at herself for being so scared. Soon, all that belated anger began to express itself in a strange and peculiar way. For the first time in her life, she wished she were a man. Not for the privileges of having that particular set of equipment that men hold so dear. No, she wanted a man's strength, so that at the supermarket she could have beaten that name-calling punk to a pulp. Of course, she realized had she been a man, she would not have been called those names in the first place. In her fantasies, she began to look like herself, but take on the strength of 10 men. She became Superwoman, and in her mind, she beat that bad-mouthed boy over and over again until he lay in the parking lot, broken and bleeding, begging for mercy. Thus, in her 48th year, the incredible secret life of Mrs. Evelyn Couch of Birmingham, Alabama began. And so there is a lot in that section that I do like and a lot that I could relate to, you know, when you have an experience where someone calls you a derogatory word and then you just go on a mental rampage. Like, unfortunately, I have definitely been there anyway, I won't share stories, but still today, too, like it's so common for people to say sexist things and to use these derogatory words against women, and people are being called out on it now more than ever, and yet it still is kind of commonplace. But I also need to voice a pet peeve, which is when white women act like they have it harder than any other group, and that's kind of how Evelyn comes across there too, where it's like, where's our group? No one uses these racial slurs in public anymore. And yet, you know, they're still saying these things against women. And it's like, yeah, there's some truth to that. But just because it's not common to use slurs in public doesn't mean that those groups don't have their own issues still, right? Like, white women aren't the only ones with problems in the world. Which brings me to the Black characters in this book and how the book represents them. So we have Sipsy, the woman who killed Frank. She works at Whistle Stop and she has an adopted son named Big George, who is also Black, and he marries a woman named Anzel. And so we get the background stories on all three of these people, but then also Anzel and Big George, we hear about their children and what their lives were like. And they have a set of twins, one of whom is very dark, but the other is very light-skinned, and the different lives they lead due to the color of their skin, and how they both have their struggles, but in a different way. And the lighter-skinned man, he has a daughter who is so light-skinned that she can pass for white. And so when she is an adult, that is what she is doing. She is shopping, passing as white, and she is talking to a lady at a counter when her uncle, the guy who is much darker, he comes up to her and he's like, oh, hey, like you're Jasper's kid. Hi, it's your uncle. And the sales lady thinks that this is just some random Black man. And she's like, oh, get your hands off my white customer. And the daughter, the woman passing, she doesn't say anything. It was just such a sad, heartbreaking scene. And yet, yeah, I liked that the author went here in some ways, right? Like she addresses racism as well as colorism. And again, I like how we hear detailed stories about all of these people and what their lives went on to be like. And I will say there's times when she writes things that are very uncomfortable to read. And yet I do think it was accurate for the time. And so I can appreciate the honesty. And I guess for historical purposes, it's good to read about what it was like, because Evelyn, she was born in Birmingham in the 1940s, and we hear her thinking now, she is in her late 40s, in the 80s, and she is thinking how she's very comfortable being around Black women and children because growing up, like the women are the ones who worked in the houses, and so it was very normal to be around Black women. And yet, Evelyn still to this day is very uncomfortable being around Black men, and it's because growing up, Black men were never around, and if they were, the mom, Evelyn's mom, made such a big deal being like, cover yourself up, there's a Black man in the neighborhood, hide yourself away. And so because she was raised in that environment, Evelyn now as an adult is still uncomfortable around Black men. But she has an experience near the end where she goes to an all-Black church, and it ends up being like just, she feels joy for the first time, and it ends up kind of being a breaking point where she starts to let go of her anger in some ways and embrace her inner, and embrace, more joy and peace and love. And she also has an interaction with the woman beside her, and she doesn't realize this, but this daughter is a descendant of Big George and Ansel. And something else I did think was well done was when Evelyn is thinking of the 60s when the marches and protests were happening, and she lived in Birmingham, and she and her white friends were shocked that this was happening, and we read, so in the 60s, when the Troubles began, she, along with the majority of whites in Birmingham, had been shocked, and everyone agreed that it was not our colored people causing all the trouble, it was the outside agitators who had been set down from the North. It was generally agreed, too, that our colored people are happy the way they are. Years later, Evelyn wondered where her mind had been and why she hadn't realized what had been going on just across town. And so I like that Evelyn has this realization, 20 years later, but that also seems so true, right? That the white people in that area would be in such denial and so out of touch and be like, oh, like these are agitators from the North. That's what's going on here because everyone's happy the way life is down here. And so, yeah, I just thought this was a really interesting section to read. But then also to talk about the KKK. So they are in both book and movie. And Grady, a man who is like one of Iggie's best friends, is a member. And he's also the local sheriff. But he talks to Idgie about how he and others don't like her serving Black people out back at the Whistle Stop Cafe, but she keeps doing it anyway. So clearly Idgie is not racist, right? And yet she is very close friends with this Klan member, which right there is kind of unfortunate. Like, I feel like an idealized version of Idgie would be like, she wouldn't put up with any of this, and she wouldn't be friends with someone who's a member of the Klan. And yet, I think the more realistic portrayal is that she would still be friends with him, because at the time, I feel like the Klan was so normalized that even if you didn't agree with their views, you would still be willing to, be close friends with members of it. Again, because it was just so commonplace. But also in the book, an issue I had is that it makes it seem like Grady and his Klan aren't as bad as groups from other towns. And I don't know if this was or is true, like if certain towns, if their Klan is more violent than others who are more peaceful. But a peaceful KKK seems like a contradiction, to say the least. And so, yeah, it almost felt like Fanny Flagg wasn't being honest about the evils of the KKK, no matter how violent or not your group is, like it still is a hateful, horrible, horrible group. And in the movie, we get a scene where the Klan from another town takes Big George and is beating him, and Grady and Idgie come and save him. And this was not in the book, but I was not a fan of it here. And it seemed like it was just unnecessarily showing violence towards a Black man. And then the fact that Grady, who is a Klan member himself, steps in and saves Big George, it's like, oh, he might be a member himself, but he's not as bad as, some of these others. Like there's good members. They're not all that bad. They're not all violent. And so, yeah, I didn't love this scene in the movie for multiple reasons. And so I'm glad that both book and movie address the Klan, because obviously this was a big part of the South at this time. And yet both of them, I'm not totally happy with how they did it. And it seems like in some ways Fanny Flagg is almost looking at the past through rose-colored glasses. Again, aren't the KKK against gay people too? So it seems like the fact that they don't experience any discrimination, Ruth and Idgie, but then also being like, oh, like some Klan members were nice, look at Grady. And then, yeah, so it seems like she's looking at the past through rose-colored glasses in some ways. And yet at other times, she tackles the subject so well, I thought, So I don't know. I feel so conflicted about it, kind of, because I like that she's talking about it. And for historical reasons, it's interesting to hear these stories, even if they are uncomfortable or messed up to read. And yet other times I feel like she didn't handle it very well. But when it comes to book versus movie, so this is honestly kind of tough, and I feel like I would rate these about the same, and yet I like different things about each of them. So first of all, the cast in the film is incredible. I love Kathy Bates, but the whole cast is just so good. And I liked hearing about so many Towns members in the book. And again, especially fleshing out the Black characters, I liked a lot. And yet I can understand why the movie chose to focus in on just Idgie and Ruth. But then also because the movie is more focused, I felt more connected to Ruth and Idgie in the film, I think, than I did in the book, especially Ruth, because in the book, I feel like we didn't get to know Ruth very well. Like, I wish we delved into her even more. But again, because the book is delving into so many people, like there's pros and cons to that, because when Ruth died, I almost wasn't that bothered by it, whereas in the film, it was a much more emotional scene because the film was much more focused. But then ultimately, Evelyn, like I said, she is who I was most attached to just all the way around, and I loved her transformation in both. The movie doesn't show her. I mean, we kind of see her leaving the angry phase and coming to a place of peace. But yeah, I mean, Kathy Bates, she's just amazing. And I loved her in this movie. And then I loved Evelyn in the book as well. But then I didn't love the fact that Idgie was involved in the Frank Bennett murder. I preferred that in the book too, where it was just Big George, Sipsy, and Big George's son. They were the only ones who knew what was going on. But yeah, all in all, it's hard to say. I guess I'll say the book wins, and yet the movie has its positives as well. So I guess I will say the book wins, but it's a close one, and I still really enjoyed the movie as well. So thank you for watching this video. Thank you for those who requested this. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.